At my dad's funeral, my stepmom ripped the eulogy from my hands, called me his mistake, lied about me to everyone, then scattered his ashes without me. Until I published the letter he wrote me days before his death that said, when she yanked the paper from my hands, the sound of it tearing felt louder than the rain outside. I just stood there, frozen, clutching half of my dad's eulogy while everyone stared like I'd done something wrong. My stepmother, Carla, looked right at me, calm, smug, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "No one wants to hear from you, Jake. You were his mistake." The room went silent. Even the priest just looked down at his book like he wished he could disappear. I tried to speak, but my throat locked up. My dad's brother avoided eye contact. My cousins shuffled their feet. No one moved. Carla cleared her throat and started reading her version of my father's life, rewriting it as if I never existed. She talked about how our family had grown closer in his last months, how he'd found peace with the people who truly loved him. I felt my nails digging into my palms. I'd written that eulogy all night, sitting on the floor surrounded by old photos of us fishing at Lake Erie, of his hands guiding mine while I learned to drive, of his smile, the one that never made it into her story. When she called me a drifter who only showed up for money, I almost walked out. But I couldn't. I just stood there, listening as she reduced everything about me to a rumor. After the service, they carried my father's ashes down to the lake. Carla looked at me and said, "You can stay here. He didn't want you there." And just like that, they left. I watched from the parking lot as they threw his ashes into the water. My own father gone without me. I waited until they left, then walked down to the dock alone. It started raining hard, soaking through my suit. The water blurred everything, the lake, the trees, even the memory of his voice. I had nothing left, until I remembered the letter. 2 days before he died, my dad had mailed me something. I hadn't opened it yet. I'd brought it with me to the funeral, tucked inside my jacket, meaning to read a line from it during the eulogy. When I pulled it out, the envelope was damp, smudged from the rain, but the ink was still legible. His handwriting, shaky but familiar. I opened it with shaking hands. The first line hit me like a punch. "If you're reading this, Jake, it means she's already started rewriting me." My knees gave out. I dropped to the wet wood, the letter open in my lap. The next words made my chest tighten so hard I couldn't breathe. "There are things you need to know. About Carla. About the money. About what she made me sign." I froze, heart racing, the rain washing down the page. I didn't know it then, but my dad had just handed me the weapon that would destroy every lie she'd told that day. My dad, Mark, was the kind of man people listened to. He wasn't loud or overbearing, just steady. The type who fixed things quietly and loved hard. When my mom died from breast cancer when I was 13, he broke in a way I didn't understand back then. For a while, it was just me and him. We'd sit on the porch every night, not saying much, just sharing silence. Then Carla showed up. She was the new office manager at his construction company. Blonde, always polished, with this way of talking that made people lean in like she was letting them in on a secret. Dad started dating her within 6 months. I didn't think much of it at first. He deserved someone. But there was something about her that felt performative, like she was always auditioning for something. When they got married 2 years later, everything changed. At the wedding, she hugged me in front of everyone and whispered, "Let's make sure you don't get in the way of his happiness." I laughed it off, but she wasn't joking. She started small, little corrections, half-truths. She'd forget to tell me about family dinners or hide my dad's calls behind excuses. When I went away for college, she told me not to bother coming home too much, that my dad was finally finding peace. But every time I did visit, my dad looked thinner. Tired, still kind, still warm but distant in a way that scared me. Once I caught him staring at his wedding ring like he didn't recognize it. Then came the money talk. My dad owned half of the construction company with his best friend, Don. Around 2020, Carla convinced him to retire early, said he was too stressed, that she'd handle things. After that, he started selling off assets, transferring accounts, putting everything in trusts. I didn't question it. He was my dad. I trusted him. The last real conversation we had before he got sick was about me possibly moving back home. I'd lost my job during the pandemic and mentioned crashing at the house for a few months. He said, "You'll always have a place here, Jake." But a week later, Carla texted me saying they were downsizing and that my old room was being turned into a guest space. That's when I started realizing she was slowly erasing me. When Dad got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I tried to visit as often as I could. But Carla always had an excuse. He's too tired. He's resting. You stress him out. Sometimes she wouldn't even answer the door when I drove 6 hours just to see him. I finally saw him 2 weeks before he died. He was in bed, barely awake, but when I said my name, his eyes opened and he whispered, "I wanted to tell you something, but she's always here." Then he fell asleep. That night, Carla told me to leave, said I was upsetting him. So when I got that letter 2 days later, I thought it was a goodbye. I had no idea it was his final act of rebellion, the truth he couldn't say out loud. And reading the first few lines, I realized something terrifying. My father hadn't just been manipulated. He'd been coerced. The letter wasn't a farewell. It was a warning. That night, after the funeral, I sat in my car outside the lake house with the letter spread across the steering wheel. The rain had stopped, but everything smelled like damp leaves and smoke. I read it once, then again, slower this time, letting every word sink in. "Jake, if you're reading this, it means she's already started rewriting me. Don't believe what she says about the money or the will. I didn't change it because I wanted to. She said if I didn't, she'd ruin you." I remember whispering out loud, "What the hell does that mean?" The letter went on to describe things I hadn't known, things that made my stomach turn. Carla had convinced him to make her the sole executor of his estate. She told him it was just a formality, that she'd take care of everything, but my dad wrote that she'd been pushing him hard for months. She'd made him sign new paperwork while he was doped up on pain meds. And the worst part? He said she'd threatened me. She said she found something that could destroy your life, something from when you were 17. I never asked what it was, but she said she'd make sure everyone believed it. I couldn't risk it. I'm sorry. I just sat there in the dark, hands trembling. I hadn't done anything back then that could destroy my life. But Carla, she was the type who'd invent something if it served her. The next morning, I called my dad's old business partner, Don. He hadn't been at the funeral. Carla said he was too upset to come. When he picked up, his voice cracked. "Jake, I was wondering when you'd call. You know she told everyone you didn't even visit him." That was the first lie I got to confirm. And once that dam broke, everything started unraveling. Don told me that 2 months before Dad died, the company had been sold off. Not to a competitor, to a shell company that Carla had set up under her maiden name. She'd essentially bought out her dying husband's half of the business using his own money. I drove to the county clerk's office that afternoon and pulled up public records. There it was, her name, all over new LLC filings. Same date as my dad's last hospital admission. The fury that hit me wasn't loud, it was cold, like static under my skin. I wasn't just grieving anymore, I was waking up. Over the next week, I started reaching out to people she couldn't control: Dad's accountant, his nurse, the neighbor who used to mow the lawn. Every conversation confirmed what the letter hinted at. Carla had isolated him, monitored his calls, controlled his meds, and handled every legal decision he made near the end. When I mentioned this to my aunt, Dad's sister, she looked horrified but said, "Jake, it's done. Don't stir things up." But that wasn't an option anymore. The letter ended with a single line that I couldn't stop rereading: "You'll know what to do with this when the time comes." I didn't yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Carla wasn't going to keep getting away with rewriting my father's story, or mine. What I didn't realize was that my digging was about to uncover something way worse than money or lies. Something that made my dad's fear make sense. Because Carla hadn't just been after his estate. She'd been covering up what she did to him and to someone else. A week after the funeral, I walked into St. Luke's Hospital with my dad's death certificate and that letter folded in my jacket. I told the front desk I was his son and needed a copy of his medical records for personal closure. The woman hesitated, but eventually handed me a request form. It took 2 days before I got the call that they were ready for pickup. When I opened the file at home, I was expecting details about his cancer, test results, medication lists, treatment notes. But as I flipped through the pages, one entry caught my eye. A nurse's note from 3 months before he passed. Patient appeared unusually sedated. Requested lower dose of morphine. Family caregiver, spouse insisted to maintain current dosage. The word insisted was underlined. I read it again and again. My dad had asked for less morphine, but Carla had refused to let them lower it. I kept flipping pages, and I found 3 more notes, all with the same pattern: caregiver override, spouse request, patient lethargic. And then one more, a week before he died. Patient expressed concerns that spouse may be altering medication. Physician notified, no action documented. My blood went cold. I called the hospital to ask about it, pretending to be confused. The nurse on call that day wasn't there anymore, she'd resigned. They gave me the contact info for the attending physician, Dr. Reinhardt, who'd since moved to a private practice. When I reached him, his tone shifted the moment I said my father's name. I remember him, quiet man, always tried to stay polite, even when in pain. Then he hesitated. Look, I shouldn't be saying this, but he told me something the day before he lost consciousness. He said, if I don't wake up, tell my son to look in the lockbox. Lockbox? I asked. Yes, I assumed it was something personal. I told his wife at the time, and she said she'd handle it. I didn't think much of it then. The lockbox. I tore through my dad's house the next day. Carla hadn't moved out yet, she was settling the estate, or so she told everyone. But she had no idea I'd kept my own key. I went while she was at her yoga class. The house looked wrong. Everything smelled like lemon cleaner and fake flowers. My childhood photos were gone. His work boots were gone. Even his fishing rods, the ones he swore he'd never get rid of, were missing. I searched his office first. Drawers, cabinets under the desk. Nothing. Then I remembered something. When I was a kid, he used to stash his Christmas gifts in a loose floorboard under his filing cabinet. I pulled it up. There it was. A small black fireproof lockbox, dusty, heavy, with the combination scratched into the underside. Inside were 3 things: his old wedding ring from my mom, a USB drive, a signed letter, addressed to Attorney Wexler. The letter was dated 6 months before he died. It said, in case of my incapacitation or death, this drive contains evidence of financial and personal misconduct by my current spouse, Carla, last name. Please release to my son, Jake, or law enforcement. My pulse was pounding so loud I could barely hear myself breathe. I plugged the USB into my laptop. There were scanned bank documents, property transfers, and worst of all, a set of video clips from a nanny cam. Each one time-stamped and labeled. The first showed Carla in his hospital room, swapping out medication labels and pouring something into his water. The second, dated the day before he fell into his final coma, showed her whispering something to him, then pressing a pillow against his face for just a few seconds before standing up calmly and smoothing her dress. I stopped breathing. I knew then what my father had meant by "she's already started rewriting me." He hadn't died peacefully. He'd been murdered. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there in the dark, watching the video over and over until my stomach turned. It wasn't just what she did, it was how calm she looked after, like she'd done it before. Like killing him was just another item on her to-do list. I knew if I went straight to the police, she'd twist it. She was already legally in control of everything: his assets, his house, even his medical records. And if she really had something she could use to ruin me, like my dad said, I needed to know what it was before I went public. So I made a plan. The next morning, I called Don, my dad's old business partner, and told him everything. He didn't even let me finish before saying, I knew it. That woman's poison. What do you need me to do? I told him I needed a safe place to stay, somewhere she wouldn't find me. He offered the spare apartment above his office. It was small, old, and smelled like sawdust, but it was perfect. From there, I started building my case. I made 3 copies of the USB drive, one for me, one hidden with Don, and one mailed anonymously to my dad's attorney, Wexler. I also encrypted the video and uploaded it to a private cloud account with a dead man's switch. If something happened to me, it would automatically send to the press and police. Then, I started watching Carla's next moves. She was predictable. Within a week, she'd listed the house for sale, cleaned out his bank accounts, and started posting on Facebook about moving on and finding light after loss. I wanted to throw up. She even uploaded a picture of herself scattering their ashes together, smiling in a white sundress. I stayed quiet. I needed her comfortable. Then, one afternoon, she texted me out of nowhere. You should stop snooping, Jake. I know what you're doing. No emojis, no greeting, just that. It meant she knew someone had been in the house. Maybe she'd noticed the floorboard. Maybe she was bluffing. But my gut told me it was worse. She'd already found something to use against me. The next day, an anonymous email showed up in my inbox with the subject line, "Your future." It had a single attachment, a grainy, decades-old photo of me at 17, passed out at a party, with a girl lying beside me. The caption read, "You sure you want the world to see this, predator?" My stomach dropped. I remembered that night. It wasn't what it looked like. Everyone was drunk, nothing happened, but she'd found a way to twist it. Probably through my dad's old photo albums or social media archives. That was the thing she'd blackmailed him with. For a second, I almost gave up. If that got out of context, it would destroy me, just like she'd promised him. But then I remembered his handwriting in that letter. "You'll know what to do when the time comes." I realized my dad didn't want me to go through the courts first. He wanted the truth out before anyone could bury it. So I started putting the pieces together, her financial crimes, her affair with the accountant, her threats, and the videos. I reached out to a local journalist named Sarah Perez, someone who'd covered corruption cases before. I told her everything, sent redacted copies of the files, and asked her one question. "If I can prove this woman killed my father and stole everything, would you run it?" She wrote back 2 hours later. "If you can prove even half of this, I'll make sure the whole city knows her name." That night, I parked outside Carla's house and watched her through the window, smiling, drinking wine, scrolling through her phone like she hadn't ended a man's life. I whispered, "You won't smile for long." But the next day, before I could send the full file to Sarah, something happened that changed everything. Because the footage wasn't the only secret my dad had left behind. There was something else, something hidden inside the drive I hadn't seen yet. Something that flipped the story upside down. The night I was going to send the full file to the journalist, my laptop froze. A pop-up appeared on the screen with a message I'd never seen before. "Encrypted archive detected. Enter password to access hidden directory." I didn't remember setting any password. The USB was supposed to just hold the evidence I'd already seen. But when I tried the usual ones, birthdays, my name, even Carla, nothing worked. Then I remembered the last line of my dad's letter. "You'll know what to do when the time comes." I typed lockbox. The archive opened. Inside was a single folder called Truth. And what was in there changed everything I thought I knew about my father and about Carla. There were scanned documents from years ago, long before she ever married him. Old police reports, a restraining order, emails between my dad and a private investigator. I started reading and felt my chest tighten. Turns out, Carla hadn't just appeared in my dad's life by chance. She'd known him before she ever got hired at his company. The first report, dated 2011, was from when my dad's firm did a project in Cleveland. A worker had been fired for stealing from a client's account. Her name was Carla Mason. She'd been caught funneling small amounts of money through fake invoices. She was charged, but the case was dismissed when the victim refused to testify. The victim. My dad. He'd let her walk, and that's when she started following him. There were messages from an old coworker warning him that Carla had been asking about his family, about where he lived. She'd even shown up at my mom's funeral, years before I knew who she was. He wrote in one email, "I think she's obsessed. I made a mistake helping her avoid jail. Now she won't leave me alone." So when she reappeared years later as his new office manager, she wasn't some random hire. She had planned it. She'd inserted herself back into his life on purpose. And that wasn't even the worst part. There was a video, older, grainier. My dad recording himself in his garage. His voice low, trembling. "If anything happens to me, this woman isn't who she says she is. She's using another name. She told me she's changed, but I don't think she ever did. She knows too much about me, about Jake. She's dangerous." That's when it hit me. Carla wasn't just a manipulative gold digger. She was a predator who'd spent years grooming her way into our lives. She'd been obsessed with my father for over a decade, tracking him, studying him, waiting until he was vulnerable enough to control. And if she was capable of planning that kind of long con, then my dad's death wasn't just about greed. It was about possession. I realized then that everything, the blackmail, the letter, the threat about me, was part of something deeper. Because in one final, chilling document, a psychiatric evaluation dated 2012, she'd been diagnosed with borderline psychopathy and severe attachment disorder after her first husband's suspicious death. Her doctor's notes read, "Patient displays obsessive attachment to authority figures, expresses intent to build a family, even if she must destroy one first. I stared at that sentence until my vision blurred. She didn't just want to own my dad. She wanted to erase his past, my mom, me, everything that came before her, and rebuild him in her own image. My dad had realized it too late. That's why he was so afraid. That's why he wrote, "She's rewriting me." I sat back, shaking, and whispered, "Jesus, Dad, what did she do to you before she killed you?" I didn't know it yet, but that question would lead me straight to the final piece of her game, one that made my blood run cold. Because the reason she'd killed him wasn't just to take his money. It was to keep a secret buried, one she'd been hiding for over a decade. The next few days were a blur of nausea, anger, and disbelief. I couldn't wrap my head around it. My father had been stalked, manipulated, and finally killed by a woman he'd once tried to help. But I still didn't understand why now. Why kill him after years of getting everything she wanted? Then I found the final folder. It was buried inside another archive on the USB, locked under a password that took me hours to figure out. I finally cracked it by trying something my dad used for everything sentimental. My mom's birthday. The folder was titled "For Jake, When You're Ready." Inside were scanned letters, receipts, and one single DNA test report. I opened it, and my entire body went numb. It wasn't my dad's name listed under father. It was mine, and under child's name, a girl named Emily Mason, Carla's daughter. My mind spun. Emily, the kid she always claimed was from her first marriage, the one who'd supposedly gone to college out west. I'd met her twice, years ago, when she was a quiet teenager who barely made eye contact with me. The report showed a 99.97% probability that I was her father. I felt my chest tighten. I was 17 when that photo was taken, the same one Carla had sent to me as blackmail. That night, the party, the girl passed out beside me. It hadn't been what I thought it was. Because the girl in that photo wasn't some random classmate. It was her, Carla's daughter. My dad's notes pieced together what must have happened. Back when I was a kid, before she got hired at his company, Carla had deliberately introduced Emily to me, pretending she was just a friend's daughter. She'd orchestrated everything. The party, the alcohol, the photos. I was set up. When my dad found out years later, he confronted her. The DNA test confirmed what she'd already known. She had engineered a scandal that could destroy both of us. Then she used it as leverage. That's what my dad meant in his letter when he said, "She said she'd ruin you." He couldn't go to the police without exposing me, without exposing the fact that I had unknowingly fathered a child as a minor because of her manipulation. And that was her power. She didn't just trap my father financially, she trapped him morally. She'd built a cage around him using guilt, fear, and my name. The final entry in his notes said, "I think she's planning to tell him soon. She says the truth will free us, but she means to destroy us both. If I can't stop her, maybe he can." I sat there shaking, staring at those words, my whole world collapsing around me. She hadn't killed him just to inherit his money. She'd killed him because he finally threatened to expose her secret, that she had used her own daughter to manipulate a teenager, then spent the next 15 years controlling the fallout. And the real horror, when I checked public records, I discovered that Emily Mason, now 21, had legally changed her name last year to Emily Rhodes. Rhodes was Carla's maiden name. She disappeared right after my dad's death. And Carla had posted online that she was estranged from her daughter, that she'd lost her to bad influences. It was a lie. I could feel it in my gut. Emily was part of this, either willingly or because Carla had poisoned her too. The reason my father died wasn't just because he was sick. It was because he'd discovered that the woman sharing his bed had built her life on a crime that involved both of us. When that realization sank in, something inside me hardened. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about ending her story, publicly, permanently, and on my terms. My father had been rewritten. I wouldn't let her rewrite me too. I didn't set out to be a vigilante. I set out to make one thing true. My dad's death would not be another clean silence she could check off and forget. For weeks I moved like a ghost, feeding Sarah pieces of the file, watching headlines, waiting for the right moment. I wasn't patient because I liked it. I was patient because my dad had taught me to be methodical. Gather facts, make them bulletproof, then expose the lie so everyone had to look at it. Sarah ran a 2-part piece that hit every social feed in the city. The bank transfers, the LLCs, the hospital notes, and the grainy footage from the USB. She didn't sensationalize. She presented documents, timestamps, sworn statements. I handed the remaining copies to Dawn and the attorney Wexler. Wexler, who'd once been polite and useless, suddenly remembered every appointment Carla had scheduled with Dad during his last months. He filed a motion to remove her as executor the day the article dropped. The police, embarrassed by how neatly the journalist's timeline fit with the records, reopened the case. I met with Detective Ruiz in a fluorescent-lit room and watched his skepticism crack as I played the videos. He made the calls I couldn't: subpoenas, warrants, forensics. They found pill bottles with missing labels. They pulled surveillance from the hospital corridor. Carla's alibi that she'd been helping him collapsed under paper and pixel. But the key moment wasn't the dossier or the newsfeed. It was Emily. I found her messy, living in a shared apartment 2 towns over, halfway between anger and fear. For a long time, she wouldn't look me in the eye. She'd been raised on Carla's stories, how Dad was distant, how people abandoned them, and then told the opposite when convenient. The DNA had already told us the truth. The hardest part was getting Emily to believe it without blaming herself. When I handed her the USB, she froze at the footage of her mother pushing Dad's face down, then watching him drift. She broke in a way I hadn't since Mom died. The second twist no one expected. Emily had her own backup. Unbeknownst to Carla, she'd been recording her mother for months, not out of malice, but because she'd started to feel sick about the stories she'd been told. Emily handed a file to Detective Ruiz. Audio of Carla admitting she'd made incidents, emails where Carla instructed nurses, a voice note where she gloated about locking things up. Her testimony was brutal because it was family against family, and she spoke plainly, not like a victim, but like a kid who finally got to say the truth out loud. The trial wasn't cinematic. It was paperwork, sworn testimony, and long stretches of waiting. But when the prosecution played the hospital footage in front of the jury, the quiet, clinical room, my father's frail hand, Carla's steady movements, the air in the courtroom changed. The same woman who'd smiled at our funeral now sat small, stripped of the performance. Jurors are human. They respond to truth you can hear and not just read. Carla was convicted on charges I had never imagined I would see written next to her name: financial fraud, elder abuse, and murder. She lost everything: the house, the company stake, the life she'd built by theft and theater. Dawn testified about the shell company. Wexler produced the lockbox letter. Emily testified, and in the pause before she spoke, I thought of my dad's handwriting telling me to do something with the truth. Justice didn't bring Dad back. It didn't fix nights of silence or erase the years she stole. But it did something close. It stopped her. The city knew her name. She could no longer rewrite him or me. People came to me afterward, neighbors, former coworkers, even cousins, and said they'd been afraid to speak before. That's what hurt most, the silence that let her act. We broke it. In the end, I read the letter my father had written at his graveside to the people who mattered, the ones who finally listened. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The truth had weighed enough. When I left the cemetery, it wasn't closure in the tidy sense. It was the quiet of a page turned. I kept one last line for myself, tucked in my wallet, and whenever doubt bites, I read it. Dad's last sentence was, "Be stubborn for what's right." I am, and I'll be stubborn until the last of her lies is folded up and filed under done. Witty kicker. She wanted to rewrite his ending. I made sure she couldn't even finish the paragraph.